British values. It's a term that I, and most likely you, have heard countless times over the past few years. Everyone on every end of the political spectrum, from Keir Starmer to Nigel Farage, talks about British values.
And it's against our values.
We care whether you share the values of this country.
The idea of British values seems now to be so pervasive that a measure of your being British is whether or not you hold these values. Let me give you an example. Kemi Badenoch was born in Nigeria and she came to the UK when she was 16. She has described herself as ethnically Yoruba. Now, for those who don't know, the Yoruba are a small tribe within Nigeria. And more interestingly, she described the tribes in northern Nigeria as her ethnic enemies. So it's very clear that she doesn't have any kind of heritage or ancestry that could connect her to the UK and therefore make her British. Instead, what she has is a passport, of course, and I presume a lot of the weight is placed on her British values. So British values seem to mean everything, but do they? I mean, what are they? What does it really mean? Is the concept even useful at all? Well, that's what we're going to get into in this video. Okay, so if you haven't already, stop and take a few seconds to think to yourself, what are British values? What does that mean to you? What is the term? What comes to your mind? I'll tell you what comes to my mind immediately, weirdly. It's the Union flag. But the Union flag is not a value, it's a flag, let alone a whole list of values, right? The next thing that comes to my mind is probably something like tolerance, but I think that's just a remnant, a leftover of going to school in the 2000s and just being told constantly that tolerance is like our greatest virtue, right? And it's quite interesting to me because when I think about the values of, say, the British Army, I can name them immediately. It's courage, discipline, respect for others, integrity, loyalty, and selfless commitment. It's codified. Those are the values that every soldier and officer in the British Army is expected to live up to. I understand what the British Army's values are. I can really grasp that term, but I can't do the same for British values at all. Let's test the theory with tolerance, because it's probably a value that most people will have on whatever list of British values they chalk up together. Well, is it really true? I mean, if we're assuming that British values are something that's been held through history, then we would expect to see, over our 1,000-year history on these islands, a very long history of what you would see as modern-day tolerance. But you don't. I mean, homosexuality was made illegal in 1967, but gay marriage has only been legal for 10 years. So where is this 1,000-year-long history of tolerance for other people? I mean, it doesn't exist. We spent more time building empires than we have allowing people to engage in consensual adult homosexual relationships. So are we saying that tolerance is not a value, but empire building is? You can kind of see the point I'm getting at. And I don't think looking into our history is really going to provide an answer as to where our values come from, because for most of history, our values have been very, very different to what they are now. Okay, so let's try a different definition. And this is probably kind of along the lines that you were thinking. Let's say British values are whatever, at any given time, the majority of British people hold as their values. So if 80% of the people hold a certain set of values, well, those are British values. And of course, there's going to be some people who live in the country who don't hold those values. But, you know, they're not British. They don't hold British values. It's not very Britishy, right? So, for example, there are people who believe that we should have Sharia law in the UK. But Sharia law is not a British value because the majority of British people don't think that that should be something we have here in the UK. And you probably think you're on firm ground, but you're not. Because in 30 years' time, you could find yourself on the wrong side of what you yourself have defined as British values. Let's say there's a big refugee crisis, or the demographics just keep going the way that they're going, and in 30 years' time, 51% of people in the UK believe that we should have Sharia law. Well, suddenly, you are not on the right side of British values, and they are, because the majority of people who are British here believe that we should have Sharia law. And so you are on the wrong side of history. You are no longer British. That's not very Britishy of you. So that's a real problem with this kind of definition. But even this definition, if you're willing to accept it and know that in the future you might be on the wrong side of British values, even if you're willing to accept this definition, it still has problems. Because we defined British values as whatever the majority of British people feel at any given time. Well, how do you define British people? You can't define them by reference to their values. You cannot define them by reference to British values, because the thing that you were trying to define in the first place was British values by reference to British people. And now you're trying to reference British people to British values. It's called circular reasoning. It just keeps going in a circle and you get absolutely nowhere. It doesn't make any sense. It's just sophistry. It's just talking. It doesn't do anything. And there's another problem as well. John, he's a carpenter. He lives in Grimsby, and he's lived in Grimsby for all of his life. In fact, he can trace 10 generations back, all living in Grimsby. He's clearly British, right? But what if he doesn't hold British values? What if he's a bit of a wrong-un and he just doesn't hold British values? Well, he's still British. So the idea of defining British people by their value system kind of doesn't make any sense to me at all. Now, take another example. Vladimir. He lives in Ukraine. He was born in Ukraine. He loves England. He's a bit of an Anglophile, Vladimir. And he holds all of the British values. But he's still Ukrainian, right? Vladimir is still Ukrainian. He has all of the British values, but he's still Ukrainian. You know that to be true. And it's nothing to do with the values he holds. So John doesn't hold the values, but he is British. And Vladimir does hold the values, but he's not British. So defining whether someone's British or not by their values, it really makes no sense whatsoever. I can hear you, you're screaming at the television and you're telling me British is a citizenship. It's all about whether you have the passport. Okay, well, let's test that theory. Let's imagine that the king goes completely insane one day and he grants citizenship to the entire of India. 1.4 billion new Brits. So now, according to our definition of British values, meaning whatever the majority of British people think, well, British values are now to have a caste system. It's to worship Vishnu, because that's what the majority of Brits think. Suddenly, in an instant, because of the decision of one man, the King of England, who I presume would have to go crazy in order to do this, but because of that one decision, all of a sudden British values mean something completely different. They changed instantly. And it's kind of a philosophical point, right? It's a bit of a thought experiment. But you can see that I'm right. This argument, this idea, this definition of British values doesn't hold up. If you're confused by this point in the video and you haven't already clicked off, which I'm rather impressed at, that's kind of my point, right? It is really confusing. It's a confusing topic. And politicians pretend like it's not, like we all understand what British values are. We all understand how they're to be defined and that it's really clear and obvious. And it used to be. We didn't used to have the problem of circular reasoning, and here's why. Because British values could be defined as whatever the majority of British people held as their values. And that used to make sense because British people were not defined by what values they held. They were defined by whether they were ethnically English, Irish, Scottish, or Welsh. But everything's changed. We don't live in a country anymore where 99.8% of people are one of those ethnicities, right? We don't live in that country anymore. We live in a multi-ethnic country. I mean, we did anyway, but we live in a more multi-ethnic country than we've ever done in the past. And so that's why it's really confusing. It's a really confusing topic. Now, look, you could try that definition today. You could say British values are whatever the majority of ethnically English, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh people think. And you could try that and you could come up with a definition and you would escape the circular reasoning and live happily ever after. But not quite, because now you have to exclude all of the values of British Indians and British Nigerians. And of course, a lot of people would say, fine, I'm happy to do that. But it gets a little bit more complicated. What about someone who's, ethnically Indian or ethnically Yoruba, for example, but they've lived in this country, unlike Kemi Badenoch, for 3 or 4 generations even. They have no knowledge of their homelands whatsoever. But now you're excluding entirely their views from being part of British views. Like I say, some people will simply say, fine, so be it. They're not native to these islands, their views are irrelevant as to the broader picture of British views. I guess that's an approach. Now, I know that was kind of a philosophical and semantic discussion, kind of read more like an essay than a normal sort of YouTube video or vlog. And I don't expect this video to do very well, but I think it's a really interesting topic because politicians, as I say, use this term British values all the time as if it's well understood. And I really, really don't believe it is. I don't think anyone has like a list of British values that all British people would agree to and adhere to. And I don't think that there's any way of defining it easily, even without a list, saying it's, I can't measure exactly what all of the British people think. But if I could, then there would be a list, and that would be British values. Even that doesn't work. I had a guy on X do his very best to try and tell me what it means to be English. He said English. English is actually very clearly defined because it's an ethnicity, but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. And he said, it's not about geographical location of your birth. It's about your cultural expression, love of the land. It's about Anglo-Saxon words. It's about English breakfast. It's about Rule Britannia, Jerusalem, I vow to thee, my country. It's about Christian values. It's about independent thinking, about the right to be arsey. It's about our love of our glorious history, love of empire, love of our language, love of our way of doing things, love England, love the common folk, love pubs, love cafes, love of the seasons, love of our traditions, love of sport, love of banter, love of being politically incorrect, love of religious freedom, to believe or not believe. It's about being in the English gang. And then he said, but you're a ponce, referring to me, and called me a middle-class wonker. Okay, fair enough. Literally every single value that he has put on there could be held by someone that both he and I would agree are not British or not English, because he was trying to define what it means to be English. So everything that's on his list, literally everything, could be held by, I don't know, a guy who's in the Taliban and living in Afghanistan. I'm deadly serious. Every single thing that he put on there could, in theory, in principle, be held by someone who we all understand clearly isn't British. Perhaps Vladimir Putin himself likes all of those things, but he's not English. We know he's not English. So that definition just doesn't work. Anyone who tries to produce a list like that, relating to like English breakfast and liking certain hymns and the right to religious freedom and all that good stuff, right? Yeah, it doesn't count. It doesn't work. Because in theory, someone who's not English or not British can hold all of those values. Look, this has probably gone on too long. I imagine very few people have made it to the end, maybe like Sylvie, Stephen, Martin, and a few others. But I think it's a really crucial point. Politicians use this idea, British values, all the time. And so whenever I hear them talking about it, I kind of assume that whatever they're saying is a little bit disingenuous. I can't take them too seriously because I really don't understand what British values means. I don't understand what the term means. I don't know how I would even go about trying to define it, unless I was going to go down the ethnicity route, which, as I said, has a whole bunch of its own problems. And yet politicians will never acknowledge that this is a difficult topic. Very rarely will journalists try and challenge them on what those British values actually mean or anything like that. And so it's just assumed to be understood. Now, if you ask me, I think it's more of a feeling, this idea of British values. We can look at something and we can exclude it from being in accordance with our values. Take a look at any of the atrocities that have happened in the Middle East over the past, decades, right? We could say, well, that's not British, that's not our way of doing things. Of course, that's true. We can identify and exclude certain things. But as soon as you try and nail down exactly what British values themselves are, rather than what they are not, it's suddenly very, very difficult. So when you're trying to use that, as some politicians would like to do, as a test for, whether you can have citizenship here in the UK, whether you have like the right to remain, certain things like that, I don't think it really makes sense. What are we saying? If you like an English breakfast, you can stay? Okay, all right. And even if you manage to produce a big list, like the guy on Twitter who I just read out, even if you produced a big list like that, how many of those values do you have to hold? What if you like everything else, but you don't like an English breakfast? Or what if you like enough of them, but you don't like religious freedom, for example? You think Islam or Hinduism or whatever should rule the whole world. So you hold 95% of the values, but not the other 5%. None of it really makes any sense. So what am I getting at? It's a bit of a long rant, possibly a bit of frustration in here. I'd rather politicians either try to accurately define this term or simply stop using it altogether. Now, the Americans almost don't have this problem because they didn't start as like a state where everyone was kind of the same ethnicity or anything like that, America was kind of born genuinely of immigration. It was never what people would call an ethno-state, right? And so they have things codified in their, I can't believe I can't think of them, their amendments and their constitution. They have that, and that's what they can sort of turn to decide whether something's American or not. You want to take away their right to bear arms? Well, that's not very American, because according to the Second Amendment, you can't do that. You want to take away their right to free speech? Well, according to the First Amendment, you can't do that because they have a right to free speech. So we don't really have that here in the UK. We don't have that in Britain. And so we're kind of just left stuck in the mud, as I am here, trying to work out what the hell British values really means. This is a very long video, and I've been talking for 6 minutes straight about absolute waffle. I don't usually do this. I try and be a bit more precise and to the point. I'm going to love you and leave you there, I think, because if I waffle any longer, this video will be like half an hour. And yeah, anyway, it's been a pleasure. Till the next one. Hopefully this is not too depressing viewing for my fellow Englishmen, Welshmen, Irishmen, Scotsmen, and French lady Sylvie, and Dave from Texas. See you later.